Chapter 4. Making a Difference. The constants of my new job were long prayers, longer working hours, and a low salary. All I wanted to do was to make a difference. To prevent Jerry fighting on the streets, to get Dan off the glue, to get Jeff on a training course, and to help anyone get a job. I was trying to bring peace to Belfast, one young person at a time, one street at a time, but it was much harder than I had expected. I had to raise funds for a new pool table, make an insurance claim for the latest burglary, avoid getting a good beating, and learn how to load an office stapler. I experienced the reality of jargon that was part of life in Belfast then, such as culture of violence and deeply divided society. The youth club members taught me the meaning of doing the double and you haven't a fucking notion, wee lad. It was as clear as the peace line in Duncairn Gardens that I had an awful lot of work to do. My days began with early morning prayer meetings in the manse, sometimes accompanied by fortifying porridge. The Reverend Taylor seemed to believe that God listened more carefully to our prayers if we got up very early and presented them half asleep. After that, most of my mornings were filled with researching and writing funding applications and letters to every charitable trust and foundation I could find. If I were going to make a difference, I would need greater resources. We struggled to pay the wages each month, and most of the youth club equipment was old, broken or missing due to theft. I was the one responsible for fundraising, so I applied to each and every source that might be interested in giving money for peace or young people or faith-based community initiatives or Northern Ireland. As I developed my begging letter writing skills, my success rate gradually improved from 1 in 30 replying with a polite no to 1 in 20 giving us a donation. Everyone from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to Cliff Richard was tapped so that we could pay the wages, get a new table tennis table, or fund a youth weekend away to the Mourne Mountains. Every afternoon was different. Some days I would go to a training course at the Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Action in Annandale Avenue and meet my peers from other voluntary organisations from all over Northern Ireland. During the tea breaks, everyone would complain that the funding was drying up and that it was all the government's fault. On these courses, I learned how to make a good funding application and how to write an eye-catching press release because the media generally ignored you if you weren't trying to kill anyone. On other afternoons, I went to networking meetings with local youth and community groups from different parts of North Belfast that were organised by some of the citywide groups, with a view to helping us to share information and work together. Cue more complaints about funding and the government. The more outspoken community workers made it clear that they felt that certain organisations did not represent their communities. It was clear that they regarded me as a representative of a wicked patriarchal charity that was being used as a pawn and a safe way to funnel British government funding into areas of high social deprivation. Republican community workers called this political vetting, and I understood from the outrage that it was preventing IRA-controlled community groups from receiving grants from the British state. Politically and paramilitary aligned community workers in Belfast have never been renowned for their sense of irony, although their success in securing funding knows no bounds. I thought it was a good idea to give funding to voluntary groups that didn't support killing anyone, but I said nothing and kept my head down. Meanwhile, I experienced a wee taste of a different kind of vetting from the Northern Ireland Voluntary Trust. "And do you try to convert the young people in the youth club?" asked the funding officer when I asked for money to buy a table tennis table. I'd love to see me try, I thought. "No," I explained politely, "it's a Christian social action project, not an evangelistic mission." "But are you not forcing your religion on the young people?" continued the funding officer. "We're giving them somewhere to go and something to do, and they just want a bloody table tennis table," I wanted to say. But I had to hide my exasperation because we really needed the money. My only motivation was to get some new recreational equipment for the young people, but I had to work extra hard to reassure suspicious funders that I wasn't going to take their money and spend it all on gospel tracts or an airfare to bring Billy Graham over to run a tent mission on the New Lodge Road. It was a new experience for me to be the only Protestant at so many of these community group meetings, and I didn't feel particularly welcome. For most of my life, I had been in the majority in social, religious and community gatherings. Most people in Belfast prefer it that way. Sticking to your own side is easy. I soon discovered that proper community workers were Catholic, atheist, socialist and nationalist. I spoke with a Belfast Royal Academy accent, which only confirmed the assumption that I was a middle-class do-gooder. I learned from more seasoned community workers that community development was all about doing only what the community wanted. I agreed with this, but I noticed some men who had been community workers for years didn't bother asking their community and just put forward what they wanted. When I made the suggestion that working together on social issues across the community divide might have more impact than doing it separately, I was challenged. My community does not want any of your so-called cross-community work that pretends that the problem here is sectarianism between Catholics and Protestants and not the presence of the British war machine in the 6-county statelet, explained a humourless community worker who had presumably consulted every single resident in his estate on the matter before making this pronouncement. I was learning every day about how the British Army was making the situation worse rather than better. But I desperately wanted to point out that most of the Catholic young people I worked alongside every day talked openly about hating all them orange bastards on the other side of the peace line. This seemed to me like the kind of ingrained sectarianism that wouldn't go away with the departure of the British Army. Growing up on my side, I had always despaired that so many people were against reaching out to the other side. It was a revelation to discover that it was pretty much the same on this side. One morning, John Evans informed me that we would be having a top-secret visit from a VIP that afternoon. Security would be very tight. John declined to divulge the name of the special guest, but I assumed it was more likely to be Margaret Thatcher than Dirty Den from EastEnders. As the time of the visit approached and Joan, the charity secretary, organised proper teacups and saucers and a few packets of Mr. Kipling's cakes, the soldiers outside created a high-security exclusion zone around the Saltshaker Centre. When the visitor, who turned out to be Richard Needham MP, Under-Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, arrived, he had several Saracen loads of soldiers with rifles with him for protection. Very well for him, but I was concerned about when they all went home to England and left us open to possible attacks as punishment for hosting a British minister in a Republican community. When he arrived, he was ushered into John's office by several civil servants in suits, while security men guarded the door and watched out the windows for snipers. I could feel my heart beating faster and faster. I was nervous that I might not be able to answer the MP's questions, or that the provost might try to bomb him for invading their territory, or shoot us for allowing him to venture into our premises. We employ over 50 people in the ACE scheme, explained John politely. If local people have been unemployed for at least 12 months, they are eligible for the scheme, and we employ them for 1 year to work on various community projects. Yes, said the VIP. And what sort of work do these chaps do? We have a team of gardeners and a team of painters and decorators, and we provide a free service to elderly and disabled people who need their gardens tidied up or their homes painted. It helps the unemployed and the elderly at the same time. Mildly impressed, the MP then turned to me. I did my best to explain our youth work in as positive a way as possible, and with a minimum of ums and ahs. At the end of my presentation, Richard Needham did not look at me directly or ask me any questions, but he turned to his assistant and talked about me as if I wasn't even in the room. It reminded me of the way Englishmen in pith helmets talked about the natives in Tarzan movies just before they got speared. Grammar school, eh? 11 plus, eh? That's what we're doing wrong back home. I was disappointed that he seemed more interested in me as an example of the success of the Northern Ireland grammar school education system, which in fact failed most of the children where I came from, rather than in any attempt to address the problem of youth unemployment that his government had helped to create. My days were sometimes made trickier when some familiar-looking young people wearing balaclavas were given permission by the Republican leaders who had complete control in the community to hijack and burn a few buses and to block the main road in the cause of a free Ireland right outside the front door. Walking around smouldering vehicles was a great inconvenience to my busy work schedule. The best afternoons were in the drop-in centre, when I was able to talk to the young people about their lives and to help them to sort out some of their problems. I got my eyes opened. We talked about God and contraception and how to get a job. We discussed drugs and politics, war and peace, and sometimes had a confidential chat about problems with girlfriends or a violent dad. One day, Michael was distraught at getting his girlfriend pregnant, and the next day Ed turned up homeless as his father had kicked him out of the house for taking drugs. When it came to getting a job, their sense of hopelessness was overwhelming. It was frustrating to see bright young people suffering from depression because they believed they would never work for the rest of their lives. I tried to reassure them that I believed one day they would have a good job and a decent living wage. In the short term, at least we could offer some people a job on our ACE scheme for a year. One afternoon, two of my youth club members, brothers Paddy and Joe, asked me to accompany them to their house to meet their older sister, whom they'd lived with since their parents had died. The British Army had killed their mother, and their father had died of alcoholism caused by grief. The orphaned brothers seemed both lost and hardened as a result of their tragedy. They never had enough money for the latest fashions worn by their peers. A home visit was an unusual request, and I didn't really trust Paddy and Joe, so I was cautious. When we arrived at the house, there was no sign of a sister, but instead they proceeded to show me a replica gun they kept in the house. "Sure, hold it, Tony," they said encouragingly. I declined to put my fingerprints on the weapon, just in case it was not a replica after all. I could not quite work out the motivation for this unusual home visit. It might have been a test to check if a British Army raid on their house would follow, which would make it obvious that I was a tout, and we all knew what happened to touts. Perhaps it was an attempt to frame me by getting my fingerprints on a weapon. It wasn't until I returned to 174 and saw Mick pushing the super share from the salt shaker up the road that I suspected that they'd wanted me off-site so that Mick could have a clear run at the centre. I ran to catch up with him, but the faster I ran, the quicker Mick pushed the super share. The gas fire looked like a demented R2-D2 being stolen by a post-apocalyptic looter in Mad Max 3. Out of breath and sweating, I finally arrived at Mick's flat. I rang the doorbell for a good half hour, and when I spotted Mick peeking out through an upstairs window, I shouted to him to return the heater. He didn't. Of course, reporting this theft to the RUC was out of the question, as this would have been regarded as a Protestant informing on a Republican to the British state. The consequences of this were much worse than losing a gas heater. When I returned to the now freezing salt shaker centre, the pensioners were complaining about the cold. I sat down exhausted and exasperated. Thankless wee bastards like Mick were taking me for a ride every day, and I was exhausting myself in the process. I didn't take it personally, because Mick's main income was through stolen goods, but I felt let down because I had tried to help him. Mick was clearly quite capable of helping himself. It sometimes felt as if I was making no difference whatsoever. At least Lesley's career was going from strength to strength. She was completing her postgraduate management course and getting job placements with private sector companies with yuppies and filofaxes in a Belfast city centre that seemed light years away rather than just 1 mile from the lower Antrim Road. We had agreed that the wedding would take place the following year, just after Christmas. My future mother-in-law deemed the Country House Hotel in Kells the top place for the perfect rural Ulster wedding reception, and so it had been booked for the 27th of December 1986. We had just over a year for Lesley to find a job and for us to find our first home together, which, as stipulated in my contract, had to be within 1 square mile of 174 Antrim Road. I knew from my attempts at finding a flat to rent that our house search was not going to be easy, but at least we had time on our side. In the meantime, Lesley was sharing a house in East Belfast with Jennifer, a friend from their Presbyterian church in Macaulay, who was also working in Belfast. We were happy and excited as we looked toward the big day. However, my parents' depression was getting worse. I had just as many family issues as half the young people in the youth club. My father had stopped drinking after my mother's nervous breakdown, but now he was clinically depressed too. "You'll end up in Purdysburn" was a jokey Belfast phrase to indicate that some circumstance might drive you mad. Believe me, it was no joke when both your parents were in Purdysburn with clinical depression at the same time. As I tried to support other people through hard times in their lives at the 174 Trust, I was trying to come to terms with the mental illness that was devastating my own family. Little did my colleagues and youth club members know that behind my cheerful and positive exterior, I was trying to cope with the trauma of my father's post-alcohol withdrawal symptoms and the horror of my mother's electric shock therapy. When I wasn't spending my evenings at Purdysburn Hospital, I put in a lot of time at the various youth clubs. At the weekends, I went on deputation visits to churches across Northern Ireland to seek prayers and donations to keep our work going in North Belfast. Many of these congregations seemed fascinated and inspired by our groundbreaking urban mission work, but usually their donations barely covered the cost of my petrol. I was working too hard, not getting enough sleep, and not taking breaks for meals, thanks to the limited kitchen facilities in the bedsit and the allure of Manny's fish and chip shop up the road. I ended up having to visit the doctor, who referred me to the Royal Victoria Hospital for an investigative procedure to check my stomach for an ulcer. This involved anaesthetising my gag reflex and inserting a newfangled tube with a camera down my throat to broadcast live pictures of my intestines to the consultant. On my doctor's advice and at Lesley's insistence, I decided to take my lunch break, eat more healthily, and take some time off work for other interests and hobbies. I rekindled my lifelong obsession with science fiction and bought a model Dalek kit. I began piece by piece to glue together a 2-foot-high intergalactic pepper pot of hatred on the table in my bedsit. This diversionary activity attracted a certain amount of derision from members of the youth club who called into my office. "And what's so scary about a robot with a sink plunger and a whisk?" asked Dan. "Like tone," commented Soup as he stared at my incomplete model. "You're dead on and all, but sometimes I think you're a bit of a fucking looper." As winter closed in, my 2-bar electric heater struggled to heat the bedsit, and the absence of the surpressor made the drop-in centre truly Baltic. But I kept on going in my commitment to make a difference. By the end of the year, Shakin' Stevens was celebrating with "Merry Christmas, everyone," and I was feeling more confident in my role. As 1986 dawned, I secured some funding and developed a series of new projects, including a senior citizens club at which I played the guitar for a weekly sing-along of Daisy Daisy and the Fields of Athenry. I started an unemployed club with adverts for jobs around the walls of the drop-in centre and arranged free driving lessons for the young people, which were intended to increase their job prospects. When I gushed of this success at one of my deputation meetings, several cynics suggested we might be increasing the number of getaway drivers rather than the number of young people gaining employment. I ignored this cynicism. The Tuesday Night Youth Club was going from strength to strength. It was still chaotic and unpredictable, but we were making progress by introducing more educational programmes. I arranged speakers to come and talk about the dangers of alcohol and drug abuse. We developed a cross-community exchange with a Protestant youth club in Hollywood, and against all expectations on both sides, no one was hurt during the visit to each other's clubs. The young people played cross-community pool and flirted across the sectarian divide as if they were normal. I even arranged for the youth club members to try yachting, which was as much as a first for me as for the young people. We went out on Belfast Lough with Focus, which stood for Finding Out Christ Under Sail. The young people loved it, while I vomited into the sea for most of the trip. Then we introduced a Sunday night youth club for those who wanted to explore faith. We invited rock gospel singers like Ken Duncan from Lisburn. Ken played techno rock gospel with a dazzling synthesizer like a Pet Shop Boy, but more Christian and less gay, of course. This Sunday night youth club was a big success, with lots of good discussion about faith and social issues. I secured a grant from the Northern Ireland Voluntary Trust for the young people to make a film with the pensioners. Our budding Spielbergs filmed interviews with pensioners in which they asked them about their childhood memories of North Belfast. After many hours of hard work, the youth club members and I showed it to the pensioners. Our intergenerational video was such a success that the pensioners cried. The young people smiled, and we even got our picture taken for the Belfast Telegraph. This was the first time our youth club completed a project, and there was a great sense of pride in the achievement. Of course, no one got a job out of it, but the increase in self-confidence was obvious. It seemed as if I was starting to make a difference after all.